The maternity ward hummed with the sound of new life. The cries of newborns filled the air, mingling with the hurried footsteps of nurses moving between rooms. It was a busy night, one where the lines between fate and coincidence blurred. Rachel Caldwell, exhaustion of childbirth, lay in her private room. She held her newborn daughter close. Rachel's mind was already drifting back to the obligations awaiting her. Charity events, business dinners, the life of a woman who had everything except the time to truly savor these fleeting moments. Her husband, Robert, had stepped out, too preoccupied with his own commitments to be fully present. In a small, dimly lit room down the hall, another woman sat alone, her frail body trembling with fatigue and fear. She was nameless in the hospital's records, just another shadow slipping through the cracks of society. She held her baby girl tightly, her only possession in the world. The child had no name, just a small, fragile presence in the woman's arms. She knew she couldn't keep her, but she clung to the baby anyway, as if holding on could change the harsh reality she faced. The hospital was overstretched that night. Too many births, too few hands. In the rush, a mistake was made, an innocent, simple mix-up that would have lasting consequences. The name tags meant for the two babies were swapped. The wealthy couple's daughter was placed in the arms of the destitute woman, while the homeless woman's child was taken to Rachel. Hours passed, the mistake unnoticed as the babies were wheeled into the nursery. Rachel, exhausted, eventually asked the nurse to take her child to the nursery. The other woman, though, resisted, her heart heavy with the decision she knew she had to make. As the night deepened, the energy in the hospital began to wind down. In the nursery, the two babies lay side by side, swaddled in identical hospital blankets, their lives forever altered by a name tag mix-up. Rachel, now resting in her room, remained unaware of the mistake. The other woman, unable to sleep, finally rose and made her way to the nursery one last time. She stood over the crib of the child she believed was hers, Rachel's daughter, though neither woman knew the truth. Her heart broke as she kissed the baby's soft forehead. With trembling hands, she tucked a small, worn note into the folds of the blanket and placed a delicate silver necklace beside it. The necklace, a simple piece with a tiny heart-shaped pendant, was the last remnant of her own lost family. She hoped it might bring some luck to the baby she could not keep. Stepping back, she whispered a tearful goodbye, her voice lost in the stillness of the nursery. She turned and walked out of the hospital, leaving behind the baby and the life she wished she could offer. Not far from the hospital, James Holloway, a farmer who had lost everything dear to him, made his way home. His path took him past the hospital, where the faint sound of a baby's cry reached his ears. He paused, peering into the shadows where a small bundle lay on the doorstep. James knelt down, carefully unwrapping the blanket to reveal the infant, Rachel's daughter, though he didn't know it. The note tucked beside her read, "Please take care of her," and the necklace glinted faintly in the moonlight. The baby had no name, just a life left in the hands of a stranger. Without hesitation, James gathered the child into his arms. The emptiness that had filled his heart for so long seemed to lighten as he carried the baby home. He decided then and there to name her Julia after his late wife, a name filled with love and loss, but also hope for a new beginning. Meanwhile, in the hospital, Rachel woke the next morning and named her baby May, unaware that the child she held was not her own. And so, on that fateful night, two lives were set on paths not meant for them, their futures forever changed by a single, innocent mistake. The house May called home was an architectural masterpiece. Tall glass windows reflected the manicured lawns and the city skyline beyond. Inside, marble floors echoed with the quiet steps of housekeepers and the occasional murmur of conversation. It was a place where everything seemed perfect on the surface, except perhaps for the people living inside. May grew up surrounded by luxury, yet there was a stark coldness to it all. Her parents, Rachel and her husband, were often away, absorbed in their business ventures or social obligations. When they were home, their interactions with May were brief, formal, as though she were just another responsibility to be managed. Birthdays were celebrated with lavish parties, but the joy felt hollow, the affection forced. As a child, May would sit in her spacious, meticulously decorated bedroom, staring out at the world through the large windows. She had everything a child could ask for: expensive toys, designer clothes, private tutors. But as she watched other children play in the park below, a strange feeling would creep over her, a kind of yearning she couldn't quite name. In the grand dining room, dinners were often silent affairs, the clinking of cutlery on fine china filling the void where conversation should have been. Rachel would ask about May's day, but her eyes would often drift to her phone or the papers in front of her. May learned early on that the right answers were the ones that required the least follow-up. She became adept at crafting responses that were neither too enthusiastic nor too troubled, just enough to satisfy her mother's minimal curiosity. Far away from the city's glittering towers, in a small, weather-beaten farmhouse, Julia's life was a world apart. The house, though old and worn, exuded warmth. The creaking floorboards told stories, the peeling wallpaper held memories, and the smell of fresh bread baking in the oven made it feel like home. Julia grew up with James, a man of few words, but infinite kindness. His hands, rough and calloused from years of farm work, were gentle when he taught her how to plant seeds or milk the cows. Every morning, they would rise before the sun, sharing a quiet breakfast of oatmeal and coffee. The mornings were their time, a ritual that connected them in ways that didn't need words. James taught Julia the value of hard work, but more importantly, he taught her the value of compassion. When a neighbor's barn caught fire, they were the first to offer help. When the crops didn't yield as much as expected, they made do with less, never complaining, always grateful for what they had. Their bond was forged in these small, everyday moments: mending fences, feeding the chickens, sharing stories by the fire at night. Julia learned to appreciate the simple joys of life, like the way the sun cast long shadows over the fields at dusk, or the sound of rain on the tin roof. These were the things that made her world feel full, even when it was just the two of them. One summer evening, as the last light faded from the sky, Julia and James sat on the porch, sipping lemonade. The day had been long, and they were both tired, but it was the kind of tired that came with the satisfaction of a job well done. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the sounds of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. "Tomorrow we'll need to fix that gate by the north field," James said, breaking the quiet. His voice was gruff but kind. Julia nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I'll get the tools ready in the morning." James looked at her, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You've become quite the farmer, Julia. Your folks would be proud." Julia's heart swelled at his words. James rarely spoke of her parents, but when he did, it was always with a quiet reverence. She didn't remember them, just vague images and feelings she wasn't sure were real, but in James she had found a father, a mentor, and a friend. The next day they worked side by side, repairing the gate. It was hard, dirty work, but neither complained. They didn't need to talk much, their actions spoke for them. A shared glance, a nod, a small gesture. They communicated in a language all their own. Meanwhile, back in the city, May stood by her bedroom window, watching the world outside. Despite all the luxury around her, the emptiness inside grew. She couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to life than this gilded cage. The sun had just begun to climb over the horizon when Julia stood before the mirror in her small, rustic bedroom. The reflection that stared back at her was one of a girl with bright eyes, her hair neatly pulled back and wearing the crisp new uniform of a prestigious high school. The emblem stitched on her blazer represented more than just an institution. It was a symbol of opportunity, a gateway to a future she had scarcely dared to dream of. Downstairs, James was finishing his morning coffee, the familiar steam rising from the chipped mug he had used for years. When Julia descended the creaking stairs, her polished shoes making little noise on the worn wood, he looked up with a quiet smile. "You're ready," he said simply, the words heavy with pride. Julia nodded, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nerves. "I'm ready," she echoed, though the butterflies in her stomach told a different story. The drive to the school was a silent one, the old pickup truck rattling down the dusty road. Julia watched the landscape change from open fields to the suburban streets leading to the towering gates of St. Catherine's High School. The grandeur of the place took her breath away. Ivy-covered stone buildings, manicured lawns, and students milling about in their immaculate uniforms. It was a world far removed from the simplicity of the farm. As James pulled up to the entrance, he turned to her. "You'll do just fine, Julia," he said, his voice steady. There was no need for more. His confidence in her was clear. "Thank you, James, for everything," she replied, squeezing his hand before stepping out of the truck. As she walked towards the main building, her heart felt like it might burst from her chest, but she held her head high, determined to prove herself worthy of the chance she'd been given. Inside the school, May was already settled into her routine, her presence commanding attention without effort. She moved through the halls like a queen among subjects, her gaze cool, her posture perfect. Other students parted for her as she passed, their conversations lowering to whispers. To them, May was untouchable, a figure of wealth and privilege they could only envy. When May saw Julia for the first time, it was at the assembly where new students were introduced. Julia, seated near the back, listened intently as the headmaster welcomed the scholarship students. Her uniform, though new, didn't have the tailored fit of the others. She stood out, not just because she was unfamiliar, but because she seemed out of place in this world of ease and excess. May's eyes narrowed slightly as she observed the new girl. There was something in Julia's posture that caught her attention, but just as quickly, May dismissed it. Over the next few days, Julia's presence at St. Catherine's became a curiosity among the students. Some admired her for earning her place through merit. Others looked down on her for the same reason. It was in the latter group that May's influence was strongest. May's disdain for Julia was never vocalized. It didn't need to be. Instead, it was expressed in the small, calculated ways that hurt the most. A slight smirk as Julia passed, a deliberate turning of her back when Julia entered the room, the way May's friends followed suit, mimicking her behavior. When groups were formed for projects, May made sure Julia was left out, subtly ensuring the divide between them was clear. Julia, for her part, tried to stay focused on her studies, but the isolation was palpable. She could feel the stares, the whispers, the unspoken rules she was expected to follow, but never fully understood. The first time she walked into the cafeteria, tray in hand, she hesitated. There was an open seat at a table with some other students, but before she could sit, May slid into the seat next to her friends. filling the space. "Oh, sorry," May said with a feigned innocence that didn't match the glint in her eyes. "Were you going to sit here?" Julia forced a smile, shaking her head as she moved to a table in the corner, sitting alone. She ate quickly, the food tasting like cardboard in her mouth, her eyes fixed on her tray to avoid the gazes of the others. There were no harsh words or overt actions, just a cold, calculated exclusion that slowly eroded Julia's confidence. May's superiority was felt in every interaction, a silent reminder of the power dynamics at play. As the days turned into weeks, Julia found solace in the library, burying herself in books and studies. It was the one place where she could escape the suffocating atmosphere of the school's social hierarchy. But even there, the shadow of May's presence loomed, a constant reminder of the battle she faced every day just to belong. The days at St. Catherine's blurred into a routine of isolation and perseverance for Julia. Each morning, she walked through the imposing gates with her head held high, though the weight of the unspoken hostility pressed down on her shoulders. The whispers, the subtle glances, the calculated exclusion. None of it was overt, but it was relentless. Still, Julia refused to let it break her. In the quiet corners of the library, she found refuge. The rows of books offered solace, a world where she could escape the unkindness that shadowed her every step. She buried herself in her studies, her fingers tracing the worn pages of textbooks, as if they held the answers to more than just her academic challenges. The library became her sanctuary, a place where knowledge shielded her from the social coldness outside. Each evening, Julia would sit by the small wooden desk in her room and write to James. The letters were her lifeline, a way to pour out the struggles she kept bottled up during the day. She never mentioned the bullying. There was no point in worrying him, but she wrote about her classes, the books she was reading, and the new world she was trying to navigate. James, in turn, wrote back with simple words of encouragement, his handwriting steady and sure. "Keep your chin up, Julia," one letter said. "You're stronger than you think. I will always be here." Julia would read his words late into the night, the letters tucked under her pillow like talismans. They reminded her of home, of the warmth of the kitchen after a long day, of the way the sun set over the fields, casting everything in a golden light. The farm was her anchor, and James her compass, guiding her through the storm she faced each day. It was during one of these long school days, at a charity event hosted by St. Catherine's, that Rachel first noticed Julia. The event was grand, as everything at the school tended to be, with parents and donors mingling in the large assembly hall, surrounded by displays of student achievements. Rachel moved through the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging pleasantries, her mind only half engaged as she scanned the room. Her eyes fell on Julia, standing quietly by the table showcasing the school's academic awards. She was alone, as usual, her posture straight but not stiff, her focus entirely on the information before her. Rachel watched as Julia's fingers brushed over the medals and certificates, a faint smile playing on her lips as she read the names. It was a small, almost imperceptible moment, but something about the girl caught Rachel's attention. There was a familiarity in Julia's concentration, in the way she seemed to absorb every detail, as though the world around her had fallen away. Rachel felt a stir of recognition, a nagging sense that she had seen this kind of focus before. But where? The thought lingered as she continued her rounds, but Julia remained in the back of her mind, an unsolved puzzle. After the event, Rachel mentioned the girl to one of the teachers. "Who's the student over by the academic display?" she asked casually, keeping her tone light. "Julia," the teacher replied. "She's one of our scholarship students. Very bright, very dedicated. She's been working hard to fit in, but it hasn't been easy for her." Rachel nodded, her curiosity piqued. "Thank you," she said, though her mind was already turning over the possibilities. There was something about this Julia that seemed familiar. A few weeks later, Julia took a job at a restaurant in the city to help support herself and James. It wasn't glamorous work, mostly bussing tables, washing dishes, and occasionally waiting on customers, but it was steady, and the income was a necessary supplement to the small farm's earnings. The restaurant was one of many properties owned by Rachel's family. Julia approached her job with the same determination she applied to her studies. She arrived early, stayed late, and never complained, even when the work was grueling or the customers were difficult. Slowly, her quiet dedication began to earn her the respect of the staff. They noticed how she would step in to help when things got busy, how she never shirked the less desirable tasks, and how she treated everyone with the same unassuming kindness. Rachel, during one of her visits to the restaurant, observed Julia in action. She watched as the girl moved through the dining room, her face calm and focused, her actions efficient and precise. There was no trace of the awkwardness that often accompanies youth. Julia carried herself with a quiet confidence that belied her age. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this girl than met the eye, and the familiarity she had felt at the school deepened. Rachel had never been one to dwell on students beyond her immediate circle of interest. As the mother of one of St. Catherine's most prominent pupils, she was often preoccupied with the demands of high society, charity events, and ensuring that May remained at the pinnacle of academic and social success. But lately, her thoughts had begun to drift more frequently toward Julia. Rachel would spot Julia in the school halls, always alone but never seeming lonely. There was a quiet determination in the girl that set her apart from her peers. She noticed how Julia remained unruffled in the face of the subtle ostracism from other students, including May. Rachel had seen this dynamic play out before, but something about Julia's composed resilience piqued her interest. Their conversations began in passing, polite exchanges when Rachel visited the school. At first, they were the usual pleasantries Rachel shared with many students, but there was something about Julia that made her linger a bit longer. Julia's responses were always measured, never giving away more than necessary, but Rachel could sense there was depth behind those clear, focused eyes. One afternoon, during a school event, Rachel found herself standing beside Julia at a refreshment table. The hall was abuzz with chatter, but in that moment, it felt as if they were the only two people in the room. "How are you finding the term, Julia?" Rachel asked, her tone casual. "It's challenging, but I'm learning a lot," Julia replied, her voice steady. She glanced at Rachel, polite but cautious. Rachel nodded, reaching for a cup of tea. "That's good to hear. St. Catherine's can be demanding, but it seems you're handling it well." Julia hesitated for a moment before responding. "It's different from what I'm used to, but I'm adapting." Rachel smiled, noting the girl's composed response. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask. The school has many resources available to help students succeed." "Thank you, Mrs. Anderson. I appreciate that." Julia's eyes met Rachel's briefly, her expression guarded but grateful. As they parted ways, Rachel couldn't shake the sense that Julia was holding back, though from what, she couldn't tell. There was an unspoken story behind the girl's quiet demeanor, and Rachel found herself increasingly curious to understand it. Meanwhile, May had begun to notice her mother's growing interest in Julia. It started with subtle changes. Rachel asking more about Julia's performance in school, mentioning her name more frequently at home. These small shifts didn't go unnoticed by May, and each one added to the gnawing resentment building inside her. At first, May tried to brush it off, telling herself that it was just her mother being thorough. But as Rachel's interest in Julia became more apparent, May's feelings of insecurity deepened. She began to worry that Julia's quiet competence might overshadow her own accomplishments, that her mother might see something in Julia that she didn't see in her own daughter. May's behavior toward Julia grew colder. In the hallways, she would pass Julia without so much as a glance, and during group activities, she made a point of excluding her. But unlike other students, Julia didn't seem visibly affected by May's actions, which only fueled May's frustration. She couldn't understand why her attempts to isolate Julia didn't work the way they did with others. This internal conflict began to manifest in other areas of May's life. She became more distant, more irritable, even lashing out at friends who questioned her change in demeanor. At home, she was short with Rachel, snapping at her over trivial matters. Rachel, preoccupied with her own growing curiosity about Julia, didn't press her daughter, which only deepened the wedge between them. It was on one of Rachel's drives back from a meeting in the city that her car began to sputter and eventually stalled near a quiet stretch of road. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the fields, and Rachel was miles from any help. Frustration welled up inside her as she checked her phone, realizing she had no signal. As she contemplated her options, a pickup truck pulled up behind her, and a man in his late 60s stepped out. He was tall, with a weathered face and a calm, steady demeanor that spoke of years spent working the land. "Need some help?" he asked, approaching her car. Rachel sighed in relief. "Yes, please. The engine just died on me and I can't get a signal out here." The man nodded, taking a look under the hood. "I can give you a ride back to my place," he offered after a few minutes. "I've got tools there, and I can probably get this running again." Rachel hesitated for a moment, but then agreed. "Thank you. I'd appreciate that." The drive to his farmhouse was quiet, the only sound the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. When they arrived, the man, who introduced himself as James, led Rachel into the warm, cozy kitchen of his home. As James worked on fixing the car, Rachel's eyes wandered around the room. The walls were lined with photographs, most of them old and worn, depicting a younger James with his family. One photo, however, caught her eye. A picture of Julia, standing beside James with a shy smile on her face. The sight of the girl in such a different setting gave Rachel pause. James noticed her gaze. "That's Julia," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "She's been with me since she was a baby." Rachel turned to him. Curiosity piqued. "She's not your daughter?" "No," James replied, his voice carrying a note of quiet reflection. "I found her one night, left on my doorstep. All she had was a blanket, a note, and this." He walked over to a small box on the kitchen table, opening it to reveal a delicate necklace and a few cards, yellowed with age. Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she held the 3 small cards James had given her. The writing on each was unmistakable: her husband's neat script, her mother's elegant flourishes, and her father-in-law's bold, confident strokes. They were the very same congratulatory notes she had received when May was born, each one filled with joy and hope for the future. But seeing them here, in this weathered farmhouse, alongside the necklace she thought had been lost forever, sent a chill down her spine. "How did you come by these?" Rachel asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. James, unaware of the storm brewing within her, simply shrugged. "They were with Julia when I found her. I always wondered about her past, but I didn't want to pry too much. She's been like a daughter to me, and that's all that mattered." Rachel nodded, forcing a smile as she carefully placed the cards and the necklace back into the box. "Thank you for showing me these. I think I might be able to help find out where Julia came from." James looked at her with a mixture of hope and concern. I've always wanted to know, for her sake. She deserves to know who she is. Rachel promised to keep him informed, but as she drove away from the farmhouse, her thoughts were a tangle of questions and fears. The cards, the necklace. How had they ended up with Julia? The possibilities gnawed at her, each more unsettling than the last. The only way to find the truth was to investigate, and she knew she had to do it discreetly. If there was a connection between Julia and her family, she needed to understand it fully before revealing anything. Over the next few weeks, Rachel threw herself into the investigation. Her first stop was the hospital where May had been born. The years had not been kind to the old building, but some of the staff remained, including a nurse who had worked the maternity ward on that fateful night. Rachel approached her with a carefully crafted story about tracing family history. The nurse, now retired and spending her days volunteering, was hesitant at first. But as Rachel pressed gently, mentioning the misplaced items and the unusual circumstances of May's birth, the nurse's expression softened. "I do remember something," the nurse said slowly, her brow furrowed in concentration. "There was a mix-up that night. 2 babies born at almost the same time. It was chaotic, with so many deliveries. We corrected the mistake quickly, or so we thought." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean by a mix-up?" The nurse shook her head as if trying to recall distant memories. "One of the babies was temporarily misplaced, put in the wrong crib. We switched them back, but it was all so rushed. I always wondered if everything was truly sorted." Rachel thanked the nurse, her mind reeling. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but there were still gaps, still too many unanswered questions. She spent hours poring over hospital records, combing through birth certificates, anything that could provide a clue. The more she found, the more she suspected that the mistake had never been fully corrected. Her anxiety grew with each discovery. She started to lose sleep, lying awake at night, replaying the events in her mind. The implications of her suspicions were overwhelming, but she knew she couldn't stop. She needed to know, for Julia's sake, and for her own. Back at home, May was grappling with her own turmoil. She sensed her mother's preoccupation and resented the secrecy that surrounded it. The distance between them, which had been growing ever since Julia came into their lives, now felt like a chasm. May found herself caught between her growing awareness of Julia's struggles and the bitterness that had taken root in her heart. She lashed out in small, destructive ways, snapping at friends, withdrawing from activities she once loved, even picking fights with her mother over trivial matters. Yet, despite her anger, there was a gnawing guilt that she couldn't shake. She knew that Julia had done nothing wrong, that the girl had suffered in ways May could barely comprehend. But the fear of losing her mother's attention, her privileged place in the world, was too much to bear. One evening, May confronted her mother, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. "Why are you spending so much time on this? On her? What aren't you telling me?" Rachel looked at her daughter, seeing the pain in her eyes, and felt a pang of guilt. "I'm just trying to help someone who needs it, May. It doesn't change anything between us." But May wasn't convinced. She stormed out of the room, leaving Rachel to wrestle with the truth she was uncovering and the impact it was having on her family. Determined to find closure, Rachel arranged for a secret DNA test. She had managed to collect a sample of Julia's hair, and now, as she sent it off to the lab, she knew that the results could change everything. The waiting was agonizing. Each day Rachel's anxiety grew, her mind racing with the possibilities. What if Julia was her daughter? What if the life May had been living, the life Rachel had so carefully crafted, was built on a mistake? Finally, the day came. The envelope arrived, plain and unassuming, but its contents held the answers Rachel had been seeking. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she tore it open. Rachel sat in her car, the DNA results still clutched in her trembling hands. The truth was, there in black and white, Julia was her daughter. The child she had lost, the one she never knew, had been taken from her. And May was the child who had been switched, who had lived a life that wasn't meant to be hers. Rachel's heart ached with the weight of the discovery, a mix of guilt, sorrow, and confusion washing over her. She had invited James to her house as soon as she'd received the results. Now, as she sat there, staring at the warm glow of the farmhouse windows, she felt an overwhelming fear. How could she confront James? What would she say to Julia? And what about May, the daughter she had raised? Taking a deep breath, Rachel forced herself out of the car and walked toward the door. Her steps were slow, hesitant, as though each one took her closer to a reality she wasn't prepared to face. She knocked, the sound sharp and out of place in the quiet evening. James opened the door, a warm smile spreading across his face when he saw Rachel. "Rachel, come in," he said, stepping aside to let her enter. "Is everything all right?" Rachel nodded, but her face betrayed her. "James, I need to talk to you. It's about Julia." James's smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. He led her into the living room, where the fire crackled softly in the hearth. They sat down, the warmth of the room doing little to ease the tension that had settled between them. "What's going on, Rachel?" James asked, his voice low and steady. Rachel swallowed hard, struggling to find the right words. "James, I've been doing some digging into Julia's past, trying to help you find out where she came from. And I found something I didn't expect." James's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Rachel hesitated, then handed him the envelope containing the DNA results. "I had a DNA test done, comparing Julia's DNA with mine. James, the results show that she's my daughter. My biological daughter." The silence that followed was deafening. James stared at the paper in his hands, his eyes scanning the results over and over, as though willing them to change. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The shock, the disbelief, it was all there on his face. Finally he looked up at Rachel, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you sure? How could this happen?" Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "There was a mix-up at the hospital. The night May and Julia were born, they were switched. I've been piecing it together and the DNA test confirmed it. Julia is my daughter, and May isn't." James sank back into his chair, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. Rachel wiped away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. "I don't know what to do, James. I don't know how to fix this." James nodded slowly, his eyes drifting to the photo of Julia on the mantel. "I've raised her like my own. She is my own, in every way that matters. But she deserves to know the truth, and so do you." The two sat in silence, the enormity of the situation settling between them. Finally, Rachel spoke, her voice trembling. "I want to bring Julia back to my family, James. She needs to know where she came from, who she really is. But I don't want to take her away from you. You're the only father she's ever known." James's face softened, though the sadness lingered in his eyes. "She'll always have a place here. But if she's your daughter, she deserves to know you too. We can figure this out together." Rachel nodded, grateful for his understanding, but the guilt gnawed at her. "And May. I don't know how she'll handle this. She's already struggling, and it could break her." As if on cue, a faint sound came from the hallway. Rachel and James both turned to see May standing there, her face pale, eyes wide with shock. She had heard everything. May, Rachel started, her voice gentle, but May shook her head, stepping back as though she had been struck. "No," May whispered, her voice trembling. "No, it can't be true. You're my mother. I'm your daughter." Rachel stood, reaching out to her, but May backed away, tears streaming down her face. "Don't!" she choked out. "Don't touch me." "May, please," Rachel pleaded, but May turned and fled, running out of the house and into the night. Rachel moved to follow, but James placed a hand on her arm. "Give her a moment," he said softly. "She's just heard something that changes everything. She needs time." Rachel nodded, her heart breaking as she watched her daughter, no, the girl she had thought was her daughter, disappear into the darkness. The truth had unraveled everything, leaving them all in pieces. Now, they had to find a way to put those pieces back together, even if they would never quite fit the same way again. The farmhouse had never felt so quiet. The usual comforting silence of the countryside now seemed heavy, oppressive, as if the very walls were absorbing the tension that filled the air. Julia sat at the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly around a mug of now cold tea. Across from her, James was silent, his gaze fixed on the table, his thoughts a million miles away. It had been days since Rachel's visit, days since the truth had shattered the simple life they had built together. Julia had known how to process it all. The revelation that she was not James's daughter, that she had a family out there, a mother who had been searching for her in a way she never knew. "James?" Julia began, her voice trembling slightly. "What am I supposed to do now?" James looked up at her, his eyes filled with the deep sadness that had settled there since Rachel had left. "I don't have all the answers, Julia," he said quietly. "But I know one thing, you'll always have a place here with me. Nothing changes that." Julia nodded, but the uncertainty still weighed heavily on her. "But Rachel, my mother, she wants to take me back, to her home, to the life I was supposed to have." James sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It's your choice, Julia. I won't stand in your way if you want to go with her. She's your mother, and you deserve to know her, to understand where you came from. But this is your home too, and it always will be." Julia's grip tightened on the mug. "I'm scared, James. I don't know if I belong there. I don't know if I'll ever belong anywhere now." James reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "You belong with the people who love you, Julia. Whether that's here with me or with Rachel and her family, or both. That's something you'll have to figure out for yourself, in your own time." Julia felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but blinked them back. She couldn't cry. Not now. There were too many decisions to make, too many emotions to untangle. "What about May?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How is she going to handle this?" James's expression softened further, the weight of his concern evident in every line of his face. "That's something Rachel will have to handle, but it won't be easy for either of you. This isn't something anyone can just accept overnight." The room fell into silence once more, the ticking of the old clock on the wall the only sound. Julia felt the enormity of the situation pressing down on her, but James's steady presence was a comfort, as it had always been. "Rachel is coming back tomorrow," James said finally, breaking the silence. "She wants to take you home, to explain everything to May and to try to find a way forward." Julia nodded, her heart heavy with anticipation. "I don't want to hurt anyone, James. Least of all, you." James's smile was sad but genuine. "You could never hurt me, Julia. All I want is for you to be happy, to know who you are and where you come from. That's something every child deserves. The next day, Rachel arrived in the early afternoon. She looked different from the last time Julia had seen her, more composed, but also more fragile, as if the revelations had drained something vital from her. She greeted James with a nod, her eyes lingering on him with a silent gratitude for all he had done for Julia. "Julia," Rachel said softly, her voice filled with a warmth that Julia had never noticed before. "Are you ready to come home?" Julia glanced at James, who gave her an encouraging nod. "I think so," she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. The drive to Rachel's home was quiet. Julia stared out the window, watching the landscape change from the open fields to the suburban streets that led to the large, imposing house she had only seen in glimpses, the house that was supposed to be her home. When they arrived, Rachel led Julia inside, the cool air of the house a stark contrast to the warmth of the farmhouse. May was already there, sitting stiffly on one of the large leather sofas in the living room. Her eyes were red, as if she had been crying, but her expression was one of guarded hostility. Rachel guided Julia to sit beside her and then took a seat across from both girls. The tension in the room was palpable, like a taut string ready to snap. "May," Rachel began gently, "I know this is difficult, and I want you to understand that nothing changes how much I love you. You are my daughter, and you always will be. But Julia is my daughter too. We've discovered something that changes everything, but it doesn't change how I feel about either of you." May's eyes flicked to Julia, her expression hardening. "You say that now, but how can I believe it? You've been obsessed with her ever since you found out. What am I supposed to do? Just step aside?" "No," Rachel replied firmly. "I don't expect that. This is new for all of us, and it's going to take time to figure out how we move forward. But I need you to know that my love for you isn't going anywhere." Julia remained silent, the weight of May's resentment pressing down on her. She understood it, even felt some of it herself, the unfairness, the sudden shift in everything they had ever known. But she also knew this was something none of them had chosen. Rachel continued, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "We're a family, and that means we need to find a way to make this work. Julia, I want you to feel at home here, but I also want you to understand that May is hurting, and we need to give her the time and space she needs." Julia nodded, feeling a pang of guilt. "I don't want to cause any more pain. I don't know where I fit in all of this." May stood abruptly, her fists clenched. "I don't know either," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Without another word, she turned and fled the room, the sound of her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Rachel sighed deeply, her hands shaking slightly as she ran them through her hair. "This is going to be hard for all of us, but we'll figure it out. We have to." Julia felt the weight of her new reality settle on her shoulders. The sky was a dull grey, threatening rain as the car sped down the winding country road. The atmosphere inside the vehicle was tense, the silence heavy with unspoken words. Julia sat in the back seat, her gaze fixed out the window, watching the landscape blur by. May sat beside her, arms crossed, lost in her own thoughts. Up front, the driver, a family friend, focused on the road, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension between the two girls. They were on their way to a family event, a gathering that neither girl particularly looked forward to, but they had no choice. May had been withdrawn since the revelation of their true identities, her resentment simmering just below the surface. Julia, on the other hand, had tried to maintain her usual calm, though the burden of the truth weighed heavily on her. As they rounded a sharp curve, the car's tires skidded slightly on the wet pavement. A truck, swerving out of its lane, appeared from the opposite direction, its headlights blindingly bright. Everything happened in a blur. The driver yanked the wheel to the side, the car veering off the road. The impact was sudden, violent. The world tilted, metal screeched, and glass shattered around them. May felt her body lurch forward, but before she could react, Julia's arms wrapped around her, pulling her down, shielding her from the worst of the crash. Time seemed to slow as the car flipped, once, twice, before finally coming to a halt upside down in a ditch. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the distant sound of the truck's horn fading into the distance. May's head throbbed, and her vision was blurry as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The world felt strangely distant, as if she were trapped in a dream. Then the pain hit, sharp and searing, bringing her back to reality. She gasped, struggling to breathe, and that's when she realized Julia had taken the brunt of the impact. Julia lay beside her, barely conscious, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. The weight of her limp body pressed against May, a reminder of the sacrifice she had just made. "Julia," May whispered, panic rising in her chest. She tried to move, to free herself, but her body refused to cooperate. "Julia, wake up." But Julia didn't respond. Her grip on May loosened, her head lolling to the side. "Help!" May screamed, her voice raw with fear. "Somebody help us!" It felt like an eternity before the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. May clung to Julia, her mind racing, replaying the moment of impact over and over. She had seen the look in Julia's eyes just before the crash. A look of determination, of selflessness. Julia had known what was about to happen, and she had chosen to protect May without hesitation. The paramedics arrived, their voices a blur as they worked to free the girls from the wreckage. May's body was numb, but her mind was in turmoil. As they lifted Julia onto a stretcher, May's heart clenched with guilt and fear. Julia's bravery, her willingness to sacrifice herself. It was something May hadn't expected, something she couldn't ignore. In the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air, mingling with the soft beeping of machines. May sat by Julia's bedside, her eyes never leaving the unconscious figure before her. The room was quiet, save for the steady rhythm of Julia's heartbeat on the monitor. May's hands trembled as she reached out, gently taking Julia's hand in hers. It was cold, lifeless, and the sight made something break inside her. She had spent so long resenting Julia, so long consumed by jealousy and anger. But now, sitting here, seeing the girl who had risked everything to save her, May felt a profound shift. The change wasn't in the words she could say. There were none that would suffice. It was in the silent promise she made to herself, to be better, to appreciate the person who had shown her what true courage looked like. May didn't leave Julia's side, not even when the nurses suggested she get some rest. She stayed there, holding Julia's hand, her eyes filled with a determination that matched the resolve she had seen in Julia's before the crash. The hospital room, once a place of fear and uncertainty, gradually became a space where hope took root. May was there every day, a constant presence by Julia's side. She didn't leave, not even when the nurses gently suggested she take a break. Instead, she stayed, holding Julia's hand, reading to her from the books they found in the hospital's small library, or simply sitting in silence, her eyes never straying far from her sister. As the days turned into weeks, Julia's strength began to return. The bruises faded, the bandages were slowly removed, and the color returned to her cheeks. But it wasn't just Julia who was healing. May, too, was changing. The guilt that had weighed so heavily on her was slowly replaced by a new sense of purpose. She realized how much she had taken for granted, how blind she had been to the person Julia truly was. It was in the small, tender moments that their bond grew. One afternoon, as the sunlight streamed through the hospital window, Julia struggled to sit up, wincing as she tried to adjust her pillows. Without a word, May was there, helping her find a comfortable position. "Thanks," Julia said softly, her voice still weak. May nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You'd do the same for me." They shared a quiet moment, the kind that needed no words. The resentment that had once poisoned their relationship was gone, replaced by something deeper, something more genuine. Trust, understanding, and a shared history of pain and resilience were beginning to build the foundation of a true sisterhood. Meanwhile, Rachel and James found themselves spending more time together, their conversations taking on a new depth as they faced the future that lay ahead. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Rachel turned to James, a thoughtful expression on her face. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady but soft, "about what comes next, for all of us." James nodded, his eyes fixed on the distant fields. "It's been a lot to take in," he admitted. "But I'm grateful we found the truth, even if it's been hard." Rachel hesitated, then continued, "I know this farm means the world to you, James. It's been your home, Julia's home. I don't want to take that away. But maybe we could do something together. Turn this place into something more, something that could bring us all closer." James looked at her, curiosity piqued. "What do you have in mind?" "A retreat," Rachel said, the idea taking shape as she spoke. "A place where the family can gather, where we can work together to rebuild what we've lost. A place for Julia to come back to, for May to feel connected to her roots. And maybe," she added with a small smile, "a place where we can all find some peace." James considered her words, the weight of them settling over him. The farm had always been his sanctuary, a place of solitude and hard work. But he could see the sense in Rachel's idea, the potential for something new, something healing. "All right," he said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "Let's do it. Together." As the weeks turned into months, the farm slowly transformed. The barn was refurbished, the fields tended with care, and a small, cozy cabin was built for Rachel and May to stay in during their visits. It became a place where the family could gather, where they could work side by side, sharing meals, stories, and the simple joys of life on the land. The final scene finds them all together on a warm summer's day, the air filled with the scent of fresh grass and wildflowers. Julia, still a little fragile but smiling, sat with May on a blanket spread out under the shade of a large oak tree. They laughed over some old memory, the tension of the past replaced by a comfortable, easy companionship. Rachel and James watched from a distance, content in the knowledge that they had done what they could to mend the broken pieces of their lives. The farm, once a place of isolation, had become a symbol of renewal, a place where new bonds were formed and old wounds began to heal. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden light over the fields, the family gathered for dinner. They sat around a long wooden table, the food simple but plentiful, the conversation light and filled with laughter. Wow, what an incredible journey we've just been on together. Stories like these remind us of the profound impact that a single moment, a single decision can have on our lives. If you found yourself hooked on every twist and turn, just like I did, then make sure to hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs a little reminder of how fate works in mysterious ways. And hey, if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss out on more stories that touch the heart and make you think. I've got plenty more coming your way, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Thank you for watching, and as always, stay curious, stay inspired, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Take